Welcome, friend, to this gentle hour where we let the ancient world unfold its mysteries in whispered tones. Tonight, we're not traveling to golden palaces or glorious battlefields, but to something far more intimate, far more human. We're exploring what happened when life ended in biblical times, when the last breath was drawn and families gathered to honor their beloved dead. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a peaceful escape from the modern world, I'm grateful you've joined me. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what corner of the world you're in, and what time it is as you drift into these ancient stories. There's something deeply comforting about sharing these timeless human experiences across continents and time zones. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more journeys through the quiet corners of the past ahead of us. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the weight of the day settle from your shoulders, like dust shaken from old scrolls. Tonight, we walk the dusty paths of ancient Palestine, where the olive trees cast long shadows and the scent of myrrh hangs heavy in the evening air. You might think you know about death in biblical times from Sunday school lessons or Hollywood epics, but the reality was far more complex, far more beautiful, and far more human than most of us imagine. This wasn't a world of sterile funeral homes and distant ceremonies. Death was intimate, communal, and woven into the very fabric of daily life in ways that would seem both foreign and strangely familiar to our modern hearts. Picture, if you will, a small stone house in first-century Judea. The walls are thick and cool, built to withstand the desert heat. Through the narrow windows, you can see the terraced hillsides where grapevines climb toward heaven. Inside, oil lamps flicker against the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. An old man lies on his simple bed, his breathing shallow and labored. His family surrounds him, sons and daughters, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren. They don't whisper about his condition or hide the reality from the youngest ones. Death, in this world, is not a clinical event happening behind closed doors. It's a family affair, a community gathering, a sacred transition witnessed by all. This is where our story begins, in that moment when life hangs by the thinnest of threads and an entire culture's understanding of mortality, memory, and the divine comes into focus. The biblical world had no hospitals, no hospices, no sterile medical environments. When someone was dying, they died at home, surrounded by the people who had shared their joys and sorrows. The children weren't sent away to protect them from the harsh realities of life. Instead, they learned from the earliest age that death was as natural as birth, as inevitable as the changing seasons. But this acceptance didn't mean indifference. Far from it. The approach of death triggered a complex series of rituals, customs, and spiritual practices that had been passed down through generations, refined by centuries of human experience with loss and grief. When it became clear that someone was near death, the family would begin what we might call the vigil. This wasn't a solemn, silent waiting. It was an active time of storytelling, blessing, and preparation. The dying person, if they were able, would speak their final words to their children and grandchildren. These weren't just sentimental farewells. They were considered prophetic utterances, carrying weight and meaning that would guide the family for generations to come. Think of Isaac blessing Jacob, or Jacob's final words to his 12 sons. These deathbed scenes weren't dramatic flourishes added by biblical writers. They reflected the deep cultural importance placed on a person's final moments and final words. The dying were believed to have one foot in this world and one in the next, making them conduits for divine wisdom and blessing. The family would also begin preparing practically for what was to come. In a world without refrigeration or embalming, the body would need to be prepared and buried quickly, usually within 24 hours. This wasn't callousness, It was a necessity in a hot climate where decomposition began rapidly. But speed didn't mean carelessness. Every step of the process was imbued with meaning, every action performed with reverence and love. When death finally came, it was marked by a moment of profound stillness. The breathing stopped, the chest no longer rose and fell, and the spirit, the ruach or neshama, was believed to depart from the body and return to God who gave it. This wasn't seen as an ending, but as a transition, a return to the divine source from which all life springs. The first act after death was the closing of the eyes and mouth. This simple gesture, usually performed by the closest family member, was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it gave the deceased a more peaceful appearance. Symbolically, it marked the completion of their earthly journey. They had seen all they would see in this world, spoken all they would speak until the resurrection. Then came the washing. In a culture where ritual purity was paramount, the body of the deceased was carefully washed with clean water, sometimes perfumed with oils and spices. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about preparing the person for their journey into the next world, ensuring they left this life as pure and dignified as possible. The washing was typically done by family members of the same gender as the deceased. Women would prepare women, men would prepare men. It was an intimate act, a final service of love performed by those who had known the person best. Imagine the tenderness of a mother washing her adult child one last time, or children caring for the body of their aged parent. These moments, though sorrowful, were also sacred, final acts of devotion in a relationship that had spanned years or decades. After the washing came the anointing. The body would be rubbed with aromatic oils and spices, myrrh, aloes, cinnamon, and other precious substances that not only helped preserve the body but also honored the deceased with their value and beauty. The wealthy could afford elaborate combinations of expensive spices, while the poor made do with simpler preparations. But everyone received some form of anointing. It was a mark of human dignity that transcended social class. This anointing process could take hours. It wasn't rushed or mechanical, but performed with care and attention to detail. Family members would take turns, each adding their own oils or spices, each saying their own prayers or sharing their own memories. The body became not just prepared for burial, but blessed by the loving touches of those left behind. Then came the wrapping. Unlike the elaborate mummification practices of Egypt, Jewish burial customs were simpler, but no less meaningful. The body was wrapped in clean linen cloths, sometimes many layers of them, sometimes just a simple shroud. The wealthy might be wrapped in fine linen or even silk, while the poor used whatever clean cloth they could afford or that the community could provide. But here's what's remarkable about this practice. Regardless of wealth or status, everyone was wrapped in white. In death, the distinctions that had marked life, rich or poor, learned or simple, powerful or weak, were set aside. The white linen was a great equalizer, a reminder that all people, regardless of their earthly circumstances, were equal in the eyes of God. The face was often left uncovered or covered with a separate cloth that could be easily removed. This allowed family members to look upon their loved one's face one final time before burial. It also reflected the belief that the deceased should be recognizable in the resurrection, that when God called them back to life, they would emerge as themselves, not as anonymous wrapped forms. As the body was being prepared, other family members were busy with different aspects of the death ritual. Someone would be sent to inform extended family and friends who lived in other villages or towns. In a world without telephones or rapid transportation, this could take time, but it was considered crucial that everyone who loved the deceased have the opportunity to pay their respects. Others would begin preparing the house for mourning. Mirrors might be covered or turned to face the wall. Some scholars believe this was to prevent the spirit of the deceased from becoming trapped in the reflection, while others see it as a way of turning the mourner's attention inward away from worldly concerns. The normal activities of life would cease. Cooking stopped, business was put aside, even personal grooming was suspended. The house became a place set apart, a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Meanwhile, professional mourners might be summoned. These were usually women who specialized in the art of lamentation, trained in the traditional songs and expressions of grief that gave voice to sorrow in culturally appropriate ways. They weren't hired because the family didn't genuinely grieve, but because their presence and expertise helped create the proper atmosphere for mourning and ensured that all the traditional elements were observed. These mourners knew the ancient songs, the traditional phrases, the customary gestures that had been used to honor the dead for centuries. Their presence connected the current loss to the long chain of human grief stretching back through generations. When they sang, they weren't just mourning this one person. They were giving voice to all the mothers who had lost children, all the children who had lost parents, all the spouses who had been left alone. The sound of mourning in the biblical world was not quiet or restrained. It was loud, passionate, and uninhibited. People wailed, they tore their clothes, they threw dust on their heads. This wasn't considered inappropriate or excessive. It was seen as the natural and necessary expression of human grief. The louder the mourning, the more it honored the deceased and acknowledged the magnitude of the loss. This public expression of grief served important psychological and social functions. It allowed people to fully experience and process their emotions rather than suppressing them. It also demonstrated to the community the value and importance of the person who had died. Their death was not a small thing to be quietly endured, but a significant loss worthy of passionate lamentation. As news of the death spread through the community, neighbors and friends would begin to arrive. They didn't wait for invitations or wonder whether their presence would be welcome. Death created automatic obligations and privileges within the community. Everyone who had known the deceased, even slightly, was expected to come and pay their respects. These visitors brought more than just condolences. They brought food for the mourning family, since cooking was suspended during the initial period of grief. They brought additional supplies for the burial preparations. Most importantly, they brought their presence, the comfort of community solidarity in the face of loss. The house would fill with people, and this was considered good and proper. Mourning was not a private affair, but a community responsibility. The presence of many people honored the deceased and supported the grieving family. Even strangers passing through town might stop to join the mourning if they heard the sounds of lamentation, adding their voices to the collective expression of grief. As the preparations continued, someone would be working on the most crucial element of all, the burial place. In biblical times, most people were buried in family tombs, usually caves or chambers carved into the rocky hillsides that surrounded most settlements. These weren't individual graves, but multi-generational resting places where families were gathered together in death as they had been in life. The phrase, "gathered to his people," that appears so often in biblical accounts of death wasn't just poetic language. It described a literal reality. When someone died, their body joined the bones of their ancestors in the family tomb. Fathers lay beside their fathers, mothers beside their mothers, children beside their siblings who had died before them. These family tombs were sacred spaces, visited regularly by the living and maintained with care. They represented continuity, connection, and the hope of eventual reunion. When biblical writers spoke of the dead sleeping with their fathers, they were describing not just death, but the physical reality of burial in these ancestral resting places. For those who couldn't afford family tombs, the community would provide burial in common grounds. But even the poorest were not simply discarded. The obligation to bury the dead was considered one of the highest forms of charity, a mitzvah that took precedence over almost all other religious and social obligations. As evening approached on the day of death, the final preparations would be completed. The body, washed, anointed and wrapped, would be placed on a simple wooden bier, a stretcher-like platform that could be carried by 4 to 6 men. Unlike modern coffins, these biers were not enclosed. The wrapped body lay visible to all who gathered for the procession to the tomb. The procession itself was a profound community ritual. It wasn't a somber, silent march, but a moving celebration of life and expression of grief. The professional mourners led the way, their voices raised in traditional laments. Family members followed, supported by friends and neighbors. The entire community might join the procession, creating a river of humanity flowing from the house to the burial place. As they walked, people would call out memories of the deceased, share stories of their kindness, their wisdom, their humor. Children who had known the person would add their small voices to the chorus. Even those who had disagreements with the deceased in life would set aside their grievances in death. This was a time for remembering the good, for focusing on what connected people rather than what had divided them. The procession moved slowly, giving time for all these expressions of memory and grief. It also allowed people from neighboring houses and villages to join as the group passed by. By the time they reached the burial place, what had started as a family's private loss had become a community's shared experience. At the tomb, the final rituals would be performed. Prayers would be said, final words spoken, last looks taken. Then the body would be carried into the cool darkness of the burial chamber and laid to rest among the bones of the ancestors. The tomb would be sealed, usually with a large stone rolled across the entrance, both to protect the remains from wild animals and to mark the completion of the burial process. But this sealing didn't represent the end of the relationship between the living and the dead. It was more like closing a door that could be opened again when needed, for additional burials, for visits, for the ongoing connection between the living and their ancestors that was such a crucial part of biblical culture. The death rituals of biblical times reveal a worldview that saw death not as an ending, but as a transition, not as a private tragedy, but as a community concern, not as defeat, but as the natural completion of a life lived in relationship with God and neighbor. These practices, refined over centuries of human experience with loss and grief, created a framework for processing death that was both deeply spiritual and profoundly practical. As we continue our journey through these ancient customs, we'll discover how this understanding of death shaped not just individual experiences of loss, but entire communities' approaches to life, memory, and hope. We'll see how the simple act of honoring the dead became a way of affirming the value of life itself, and how rituals that might seem strange to modern eyes actually reveal timeless truths about human nature and our deepest needs in the face of mortality. But the burial was only the beginning of a longer journey through grief, one that unfolded over days and weeks in carefully structured stages that guided the bereaved through the landscape of loss. The biblical world understood something we've perhaps forgotten in our modern haste to return to normal. That grief has its own rhythm, its own requirements, its own sacred timeline that cannot be rushed or abbreviated without doing violence to the human heart. When the mourners returned from the tomb, they entered what was called the Shiva, though the specific term would vary depending on the time period and region we're discussing. This was an intensive period of mourning that lasted 7 days, during which the normal patterns of life were suspended and the community gathered around the grieving family like a protective cocoon. Picture that same stone house we visited earlier, now transformed into a sanctuary of sorrow and memory. The floors might be covered with dust or ashes, symbols of mortality and the temporary nature of earthly existence. The mourners would sit on low stools or even on the ground itself, physically lowering themselves as a sign of their diminished state. This wasn't mere symbolism. In a world where height often represented status and power, sitting low was a way of acknowledging that grief had brought them down, had made them vulnerable and in need of support. The immediate family members would remain in this posture throughout the 7 days, rising only for essential needs. They would not work, would not conduct business, would not engage in the ordinary activities that filled their usual days. Instead, they would receive visitors who came to offer comfort, to share memories, and to ensure that the mourners were fed and cared for during their time of vulnerability. These visits followed their own intricate choreography. Visitors would not speak first. They would wait for the mourners to acknowledge them, to indicate their readiness for conversation. This wasn't coldness or formality, but wisdom, born of experience, with grief. The mourners were understood to be in a fragile state, possibly overwhelmed by their loss, and forcing them to play host or make small talk would have been seen as cruel. When conversation did begin, it followed traditional patterns that had been refined over generations. People would share stories about the deceased, not just grand achievements or important moments, but small kindnesses, everyday interactions, the sorts of human details that paint a picture of a life fully lived. A neighbour might remember how the deceased always asked about her sick child. A fellow craftsman might recall a piece of advice that had stayed with him for years. Children might share memories of games played or treats shared. These weren't eulogies in our modern sense, formal speeches delivered to a gathered assembly. They were intimate conversations, organic remembrances that emerged naturally from the gathering of people who had known and loved the deceased. The stories would build upon each other, creating a mosaic of memory that was richer and more complete than any single person's recollection could be. Food played a crucial role in these gatherings, but not in the way we might expect. The mourning family was forbidden from preparing meals. Cooking was considered too normal an activity, too much a part of ordinary life to be appropriate during this sacred time of grief. Instead, neighbours and friends brought what was needed. But this wasn't random charity. There were specific traditions about what should be brought and when. The first meal after the burial, called the Meal of Consolation, was particularly important. It was usually provided by the closest neighbours and consisted of specific foods that carried symbolic meaning. Eggs were common, their round shape representing the cycle of life and death, their contents hidden within the shell, like the mystery of what lay beyond mortality. Lentils, too, were traditional, their round shape echoing the same symbolism, their earthy nature connecting the mourners to the soil into which their loved one had been placed. Bread, the staff of life, was always present, often in forms that had been shaped or decorated in ways that honoured the dead. Wine might be served, though often it was mixed with water. Undiluted wine was for celebration, while diluted wine was more appropriate for mourning, when joy was tempered by sorrow. The act of eating together during mourning served multiple purposes. Practically, it ensured that the grieving family maintained their strength during a time when they might be tempted to neglect their physical needs. Symbolically, it affirmed that life continued, that the community endured even when individuals passed away. Spiritually, it created bonds between the mourners and their supporters, weaving networks of mutual obligation and care that would extend far beyond the mourning period. As the days passed, the house would develop its own rhythm of activity. Mornings might be quieter, with only close family present, sharing memories in the soft light filtering through the narrow windows. Afternoons would bring more visitors, friends, business associates, members of the broader community who had known the deceased in various capacities. Evenings might see the arrival of extended family members who had travelled from distant villages, bringing news from other parts of the clan and their own stories to add to the growing collection of memories. The children in the household experienced these 7 days differently than the adults, but they were not excluded from the process. In the biblical world, children were considered part of the community of mourners, with their own roles to play and their own needs to be met. They might help serve food to visitors, carry messages between family members, or simply sit quietly and listen to the stories being told about their deceased relative. This inclusion of children in the mourning process served important educational and psychological functions. The children learned about their family history through the stories being shared. They observed how their community dealt with loss and grief. They saw that death, while sad, was not something to be feared or hidden from, but rather a natural part of the human experience that could be faced with dignity and support. The children also learned about the interconnectedness of their community through witnessing the care being shown to their family. They saw neighbors bringing food, friends offering comfort, even strangers stopping by to pay their respects. These lessons in community solidarity and mutual support would stay with them throughout their lives, shaping their own responses when they encountered others in need. Throughout these 7 days, certain activities were strictly forbidden to the mourners. They could not cut their hair or trim their beards. Personal grooming was seen as too much a part of normal life, too focused on appearance and worldly concerns. They could not wear leather shoes, if they wore shoes at all. Leather was considered a luxury, and mourning was a time for simplicity and humility. They could not engage in marital relations. The creation of new life was inappropriate during a time focused on the ending of life. These restrictions weren't punishments or arbitrary rules, but ways of marking the mourning period as different from ordinary time. They created a boundary between the world of grief and the world of normal activity, ensuring that the mourners had space and time to process their loss without the distractions and demands of everyday life pulling them away from their emotional work. The community understood and supported these restrictions. Business partners wouldn't pressure the mourners to make decisions or complete transactions. Neighbors wouldn't expect normal social interactions. Even children knew to be quieter around the mourning household, to be more considerate and less demanding of attention. As the 7 days drew to a close, there would often be a gradual shift in the atmosphere of the house. The most intense expressions of grief would begin to soften. Conversations might turn more frequently to practical matters. What needed to be done now that the deceased was gone, how the family would reorganize itself, what changes would need to be made to daily routines. This transition wasn't forced or artificial, but emerged naturally as the initial shock of loss began to give way to the longer process of adjustment and adaptation. The community played a crucial role in facilitating this transition, gradually shifting from pure comfort and support to gentle encouragement toward re-engagement with life. On the 7th day, there would usually be some form of ritual marking the end of the intensive mourning period. This might involve the mourners rising from their low seats for the first time, washing their faces and hands in a formal way, or changing their clothes. These actions weren't celebrations. The grief was far from over. But they were acknowledgements that the first stage of mourning had been completed, and it was time to begin the next phase. But the end of the 7-day period didn't mean the end of mourning. Instead, it marked the beginning of a longer, less intensive period of grief that could last for 30 days or even longer. During this time, the mourners would gradually resume their normal activities, but certain restrictions would remain in place. They might avoid celebrations or festivities, continue to dress simply, and maintain a more subdued demeanor in their interactions with others. This extended mourning period recognized that grief doesn't follow a neat schedule, that the human heart needs time to adjust to major losses, and that the community has an ongoing obligation to support those who are working through the complex emotions that follow death. It also provided a buffer between the intense, protected time of the initial 7 days and the full resumption of normal social and economic obligations. During this longer period, there would be specific days set aside for visiting the tomb. These weren't morbid occasions, but opportunities for the family to maintain their connection with the deceased, to bring flowers or small offerings, and to continue the process of saying goodbye that had begun at the bedside and continued through the burial. These tomb visits were often communal affairs, with groups of family members and friends making the journey together. They would clean the tomb area, arrange any offerings they had brought, and spend time in quiet reflection or conversation about the deceased. Sometimes they would share meals near the tomb, including the dead person symbolically in the ongoing life of the family. The tomb itself might be marked with simple inscriptions or symbols, not elaborate monuments like those of the wealthy, but modest markers that identified whose remains lay within and perhaps included a brief phrase about their character or accomplishments. These inscriptions served as prompts for memory, helping future generations remember not just that someone had lived, but something about how they had lived. As months passed, the formal mourning period would eventually come to an end. But the practices and customs surrounding death continued to shape daily life in subtle ways. Anniversaries of the death would be observed, usually with visits to the tomb and special meals that included the deceased person's favorite foods. Family gatherings would always include some reference to those who were absent, ensuring that the dead remained part of the ongoing narrative of family life. The clothing and personal possessions of the deceased were handled with great care and specific customs. Some items might be kept as memorials, passed down to children or grandchildren as tangible connections to their ancestor. Others might be given to the poor as acts of charity performed in the deceased person's memory. Still others might be buried with the body, ensuring that the person was properly equipped for whatever journey lay ahead. These decisions about possessions weren't made hastily or casually, but were discussed among family members and often reflected the expressed wishes of the deceased. A father might have indicated during his lifetime that he wanted his tools to go to a particular son, his prayer shawl to another, his jewelry to be distributed among his daughters. These bequests weren't just practical divisions of property, but ways of extending the deceased person's influence and care into the future. The biblical understanding of death and mourning was deeply rooted in the belief that relationships don't simply end when physical life ceases. The dead remained part of the community in important ways, as sources of wisdom and guidance, as examples to be followed or avoided, as beloved presences whose influence continued to shape the decisions and values of those left behind. This ongoing relationship with the dead influenced everything from daily prayers to major family decisions. Parents might invoke the memory of deceased grandparents when teaching children about proper behavior. Adults facing difficult choices might ask themselves what their departed parents would have advised. The community would remember and retell stories about deceased members when similar situations arose, using their examples as guides for current conduct. This living connection between the present and the past meant that death was never truly final in the biblical imagination. The deceased continued to exist in the stories told about them, in the traditions they had passed down, in the values they had instilled in their children. A grandmother's recipe for bread became a way of keeping her presence alive in the family kitchen. A grandfather's sayings became wisdom that guided family decisions long after his voice had been silenced. The physical reminders of the dead were equally important. In a culture where most people owned very few possessions, each item left behind carried tremendous weight and meaning. A carpenter's tools weren't just implements for working wood. They were extensions of his hands, shaped by years of use, worn smooth by countless hours of labor. When these tools were passed to his son, they carried with them not just practical value, but the accumulated skill and experience of their previous owner. Similarly, a woman's cooking vessels, her grinding stones, her weaving implements, these weren't mere objects but repositories of knowledge and memory. A daughter learning to use her mother's loom would feel the grooves worn by her mother's hands, would follow the patterns her mother had created, would continue traditions that stretched back through generations of women whose names might be forgotten, but whose influence lived on in every thread. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in the biblical world also shaped how communities remembered and honored their dead. During harvest time, families would set aside portions of their crops as offerings at family tombs, sharing the abundance of the living with those who had passed beyond the need for earthly sustenance. These weren't superstitious attempts to feed the dead, but symbolic gestures that maintained the bonds between generations. At festivals and celebrations, empty places might be set at tables, not from morbid sentimentality, but from a genuine sense that the deceased remained part of the family circle. Children would be told stories about the relatives they had never met, learning their names and their deeds, their triumphs and their failures, their wisdom and their follies. In this way, the dead lived on in the memories and imaginations of the living, continuing to teach and influence even from beyond the grave. The practice of naming children after deceased relatives served similar purposes. When a son was given his grandfather's name, it wasn't just honoring the dead man's memory, it was creating a bridge between past and future, ensuring that something of the grandfather's identity would continue into the next generation. The child would grow up hearing stories about his namesake, learning about the qualities and characteristics that had made the original bearer of the name worthy of remembrance. These naming practices also reflected the biblical understanding of identity as something that transcended individual existence. A person wasn't just their own unique self, but part of a larger family identity that connected them to their ancestors and their descendants. When someone died, they didn't simply vanish, they became part of this larger identity, their individual story woven into the ongoing narrative of their family and community. The women of biblical times play particularly crucial roles in maintaining these connections between the living and the dead. As the keepers of family traditions, they were responsible for preserving and passing down the stories, customs, and memories that kept the deceased alive in family consciousness. Mothers would tell their children about grandparents and great-grandparents, sharing not just facts about their lives, but insights into their characters, their values, their ways of facing both joy and sorrow. These storytelling sessions often took place during the long hours of domestic work, while grinding grain, spinning thread, or preparing meals. The repetitive nature of these tasks created natural opportunities for conversation and reminiscence. A mother teaching her daughter to bake bread might share memories of learning the same skill from her own mother, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge and connection that stretched back through generations. The stories themselves followed certain patterns and included certain elements that made them both memorable and meaningful. They weren't just random anecdotes, but carefully crafted narratives that conveyed important information about family history, community values, and proper behavior. A story about a great-grandmother's kindness to strangers would teach children about hospitality. A tale about a grandfather's honesty in business dealings would instill values about integrity and fair dealing. These stories also served as a form of comfort during times of difficulty, when families faced hardship, crop failure, illness, persecution, or poverty. The stories of how previous generations had survived similar challenges provided both practical guidance and emotional support. The knowledge that their ancestors had endured and overcome great difficulties gave people strength to face their own trials with courage and hope. The physical spaces where families lived were also shaped by this ongoing relationship with the dead. Homes might contain special niches or shelves where objects belonging to deceased family members were displayed, not as shrines, but as reminders of those who had once been part of the household. A father's staff might rest in a corner where he had always placed it. A mother's jewellery might be kept in a small box that her daughters would open on special occasions, handling each piece with reverence and sharing memories of when they had seen their mother wear them. These domestic memorials served multiple purposes. They kept the memory of the deceased alive in the daily life of the family. They provided focal points for storytelling and reminiscence. They taught children about their heritage and their place in the ongoing story of their family. And they offered comfort to the bereaved, providing tangible connections to loved ones who were no longer physically present. The agricultural calendar that governed life in biblical times also created natural rhythms for remembering and honoring the dead. The cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and resting that marked each year provided metaphors for understanding death and renewal. Just as seeds planted in the ground would eventually produce new life, so the bodies of the dead, committed to the earth, were seen as part of an ongoing cycle of death and rebirth that would ultimately culminate in resurrection. This agricultural understanding of death influenced both the language used to describe mortality and the rituals surrounding it. The dead were said to sleep in the earth, suggesting not permanent unconsciousness, but temporary rest before eventual awakening. Burial was described as sowing the body in the ground, with the expectation that it would one day be harvested in a new and glorified form. These metaphors weren't just poetic flourishes, but reflected deep theological convictions about the nature of death and the hope of resurrection. The biblical world didn't see death as the ultimate enemy to be feared and avoided at all costs, but as a natural part of the divine plan that would eventually give way to renewed life. This perspective shaped how people approached their own mortality and how they comforted others who were facing loss. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the biblical year also provided opportunities for remembering and honoring the dead. During Passover, families would gather to retell the story of their ancestors' liberation from Egypt, connecting their present circumstances to the great acts of deliverance in their past. The elderly members of the family would share their own memories of previous Passover celebrations, creating links between current and past generations. During harvest festivals, families would bring the first fruits of their crops to offer thanksgiving for the year's abundance. These offerings often included remembrances of family members who had died since the previous harvest, acknowledging their role in the ongoing life of the family, even though they were no longer physically present to share in the celebration. The Sabbath, observed every seventh day, provided weekly opportunities for families to gather, share meals, and tell stories that connected them to their heritage. The lighting of lamps, the blessing of bread and wine, the recitation of prayers, all of these rituals created sacred time and space where the boundaries between past and present, living and dead, became more permeable. Children growing up in this environment learned early that they were not isolated individuals, but part of something larger and more enduring than their own brief lives. They were links in a chain that stretched back to the beginning of their people's history and forward to generations yet unborn. This understanding gave meaning and purpose to their existence, even in the face of hardship and uncertainty. The biblical approach to death and mourning also recognized that grief itself was a form of sacred work that required time, attention, and community support. The various stages of mourning, from the initial intense period through the gradual return to normal activities, provided a framework for processing loss that honored both the need to grieve and the necessity of continuing to live. This framework wasn't rigid or inflexible, but could be adapted to different circumstances and different types of loss. The death of an elderly person who had lived a full life might be mourned differently than the death of a young parent or a child. The death of someone who had suffered a long illness might evoke different responses than the death of someone who died suddenly. The community was sensitive to these differences and adjusted its support accordingly. The goal of these mourning practices wasn't to eliminate grief or to help people get over their losses as quickly as possible. Instead, the aim was to help the bereaved integrate their loss into their ongoing life story, to find ways of maintaining connection with the deceased while still engaging fully with the world of the living. This was understood to be a complex and ongoing process that might take months or even years to complete. The biblical world also recognized that some losses were particularly difficult and required special attention and support. Parents who lost children, spouses who were widowed young, children who were orphaned, these individuals faced challenges that went beyond ordinary grief and required extraordinary community response. Special provisions were made for their care, special attention paid to their needs, special efforts made to ensure they remained integrated into community life. Widows in particular were recognized as vulnerable members of society who required protection and support. The loss of a husband meant not just emotional devastation, but economic uncertainty and social displacement. Communities developed elaborate systems of care for widows, ensuring they had access to food, shelter, and protection. Extended families took responsibility for their widowed relatives, and communities as a whole accepted obligations to care for widows who had no family support. These provisions for the vulnerable weren't seen as charity in the modern sense, but as fundamental obligations of community membership. Taking care of those who had suffered loss was considered one of the highest forms of religious duty, a way of honoring both the dead and the divine. The quality of a community's care for its mourning members was seen as a measure of its moral and spiritual health. As we draw toward the close of our gentle journey through these ancient practices, we begin to see how the biblical approach to death and mourning created a comprehensive system for dealing with one of humanity's most fundamental challenges. These weren't primitive or superstitious practices, but sophisticated responses to the complex needs of people facing loss, developed and refined over centuries of human experience with grief and sorrow. The rituals, customs, and beliefs we've explored provided frameworks for understanding death, processing grief, maintaining connections with the deceased, and finding meaning in the face of mortality. They recognize that death affects not just individuals, but entire communities, and they created ways for communities to respond with compassion, support, and practical assistance. Most importantly, these practices reflected a worldview that saw death not as the ultimate tragedy, but as part of a larger story that included hope for renewal, resurrection, and reunion. This hope didn't minimize the reality of loss or the pain of grief, but it provided a context within which suffering could be endured, and meaning could be found even in the darkest moments of human experience. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you some sense of connection to these ancient people who faced the same fundamental challenges we face today. How to love deeply, knowing that loss is inevitable. How to find meaning in the face of mortality. How to support one another through the valleys of grief and sorrow. Their wisdom, preserved in ritual and story, continues to offer guidance for our own journeys through loss and hope, grief and healing, death and the promise of life renewed. The shadows lengthen now as we venture deeper into the quiet corners of ancient grief, where the living learn to carry their dead, not as burdens, but as invisible companions walking beside them through the years that followed. Tonight we explore what happened after the formal mourning ended, when the community's attention turned elsewhere and families were left to navigate the longer, lonelier journey of learning to live with absence. Picture, if you will, a widow named Naomi standing in her doorway as the sun sets over the Judean hills. The 7 days have passed, the 30 days are complete, and the neighbors have returned to their own concerns. The house feels impossibly large now, filled with spaces where a voice should respond but doesn't, where familiar footsteps should sound but remain silent. This is where the real work of grief begins, in the ordinary moments when memory becomes both comfort and pain. In the biblical world, this transition from communal mourning to private adjustment was understood to be perhaps the most difficult phase of loss. The initial shock had worn off, the community support had diminished, and the bereaved found themselves face to face with the reality of rebuilding life around an absence that could never be filled. Yet here too, ancient wisdom had developed practices and perspectives that offered guidance through this trackless wilderness of sorrow. The first challenge was learning to perform the daily tasks that had once been shared. A widow might stand before her grinding stone each morning, remembering how her husband used to rise early to prepare the grain for her work. The physical motions remained the same, but they were now solitary acts performed in silence, where once there had been quiet conversation and companionship. Every mundane activity became a small confrontation with loss. Yet the biblical understanding of grief recognized that these daily confrontations, painful as they were, served an important purpose. Each time a bereaved person successfully completed a task that reminded them of their loss, They proved to themselves that survival was possible. Each small victory over despair built strength for the larger challenges that lay ahead. The ancient wisdom understood that healing happened not in dramatic moments of breakthrough, but in the accumulation of ordinary days lived with courage and determination. Children in mourning households faced their own unique challenges during this period. They had lost not just a parent or grandparent, but also the security and predictability that adult presence provided. The surviving adults, struggling with their own grief, might seem distant or changed, adding to the child's sense of a world turned upside down. Yet biblical culture had developed ways of helping children navigate these treacherous emotional waters. Storytelling played a crucial role in this healing process. As the immediate crisis of death receded, families would begin to tell different kinds of stories about the deceased. Instead of the formal eulogies and traditional laments of the early mourning period, they would share more intimate memories, more personal anecdotes. A grandmother might tell her grandchildren about the silly songs their grandfather used to sing while working in the fields. An uncle might remember the practical jokes their departed brother used to play during festivals. These stories served multiple purposes. They helped preserve the full humanity of the deceased, not just their noble qualities, but their quirks and foibles as well. They provided comfort to the grieving by keeping beloved voices and personalities alive in memory. And they taught children that death didn't erase a person's entire existence, but only ended their physical presence in the world. The stories also evolved over time, becoming polished through repeated telling until they achieved the status of family legends. A father's act of kindness to a stranger might grow in the telling until it became an epic tale of generosity and hospitality. A mother's wisdom in resolving a family dispute might be remembered as Solomon-like insight. These weren't deliberate exaggerations, but natural processes by which memory transformed raw experience into meaningful narrative. As months turned to years, these family stories would become teaching tools, ways of passing down values and wisdom to new generations. When a child faced a difficult decision, a parent might invoke the memory of a deceased grandparent. Your grandfather always said that a person's word is worth more than gold. When young people needed examples of courage or perseverance, the family stories provided heroes whose deeds were made more powerful by personal connection. The annual cycle of seasons brought its own rhythms of remembrance and renewal. The first spring after a loss was often particularly difficult, as the world awakened to new life, while the bereaved remained locked in winter. Yet biblical culture found ways to incorporate even seasonal grief into larger patterns of meaning. The sprouting of new shoots from apparently dead branches became metaphors for resurrection hope. The return of migrating birds suggested that absence didn't necessarily mean permanent disappearance. Harvest time brought its own complex emotions. The abundance of the season might seem to mock the emptiness left by death, yet it also provided opportunities for memorial acts that honored the deceased while serving the living. Families might set aside portions of their harvest to give to the poor in memory of their departed loved ones, transforming personal loss into community blessing. The grain that was stored for winter became a tangible reminder of provision and preparation, qualities often associated with deceased family patriarchs and matriarchs. As families rationed their stores through the lean months, they might remember how their departed parent or grandparent had taught them to plan ahead, to save for times of scarcity, to trust that careful stewardship would see them through until the next harvest. Winter, with its long nights and enforced inactivity, created natural spaces for contemplation and memory. Families gathered around fires would share stories, and the deceased would inevitably become part of these narratives. Their presence was felt not as ghostly visitation, but as inherited wisdom, as continuing influence that shaped how the living understood their world and their place in it. The biblical world also developed practices for marking the longer anniversaries of death. The first anniversary was often observed with special solemnity as families returned to the tomb for cleaning and maintenance, brought fresh offerings, and spent time in quiet reflection on all that had changed in the year since their loss. These anniversary observances weren't morbid, dwelling on death, but healthy acknowledgement that some losses were too significant to be quickly forgotten or easily integrated into normal life. These annual remembrances served important psychological functions. They provided designated times for grief, allowing people to anticipate and prepare for waves of sorrow that might otherwise catch them off guard. They created opportunities for family members to share their ongoing struggles with loss and to support each other through continuing difficulties. And they maintained the connection between the living and the dead in ways that honored both the reality of death and the persistence of love. As years passed, the character of these remembrances would often shift from sorrow towards celebration. Instead of focusing primarily on the fact of loss, families might emphasize the gifts their departed loved one had given them: memories, wisdom, values, traditions. The anniversary might become a time for sharing favorite foods that the deceased had enjoyed, for telling their most beloved stories, for continuing projects or causes they had cared about. This evolution from grief toward gratitude wasn't forced or artificial, but emerged naturally as the acute pain of loss softened into the deeper ache of permanent absence. The biblical understanding of mourning allowed for this transformation, recognizing that healthy grief eventually leads not to forgetting, but to a different kind of remembering, one that emphasizes gift rather than loss, presence rather than absence, continuing influence rather than terminated relationship. The process of integrating loss into ongoing life was particularly complex for those who had lost spouses. In biblical times, marriage was not just an emotional bond, but an economic partnership, a social unit that provided identity and security for both partners. The death of a spouse meant not just personal devastation, but practical crisis. How would a widowed person support themselves? Who would help with tasks that required two people? How would they maintain their place in a community organized around family units? Widows faced especially daunting challenges in patriarchal societies where women's economic and social status often depended entirely on their relationships to men. A young widow with small children might find herself utterly dependent on the charity of relatives or the broader community. An older widow whose children had grown and moved away might face isolation and poverty. These weren't just personal tragedies, but community crises that required collective response. Biblical law and custom had developed elaborate systems for addressing these challenges. The practice of levirate marriage, where a dead man's brother might marry his widow, wasn't just about continuing the family line, but about providing economic and social security for vulnerable women. Extended families were expected to take financial responsibility for their widowed relatives. Communities as a whole were obligated to ensure that widows had access to basic necessities. These provisions weren't perfect, and many widows undoubtedly suffered despite them. But they represented serious attempts to address the practical consequences of death in societies where survival often depended on family and community networks. They also reflected the understanding that grief wasn't just an emotional experience, but a comprehensive crisis that affected every aspect of a person's existence. For widowed men, the challenges were different but no less significant. In a culture where women typically managed domestic affairs, a widower might find himself helpless in his own home, unable to prepare food, maintain clothing, or care for young children. The expectation that he would remarry quickly wasn't just about companionship, but about practical necessity. A household needed a woman's skills and knowledge to function effectively. Yet remarriage after loss brought its own complications. How could a new spouse compete with idealized memories of the deceased? How could children accept a step-parent who seemed to threaten their connection to their dead parent? How could families blend traditions and loyalties that had developed around different relationships? Biblical narratives and customs acknowledged these difficulties and provided frameworks for navigating them, though not without struggle and pain. The children of remarried parents faced particularly complex emotional terrain. They might feel torn between loyalty to a deceased parent and affection for a living step-parent. They might worry that loving their new family configuration meant betraying the memory of their original family. They might struggle with questions about identity and belonging that had no easy answers. Biblical wisdom addressed these challenges through practices that honored both past and present relationships. Step-parents were encouraged to respect and maintain their stepchildren's connections to deceased parents, rather than trying to replace those bonds. Children were taught that love wasn't a finite resource that could be depleted by sharing, but an expandable capacity that could grow to encompass new relationships without diminishing old ones. The extended family system that characterized biblical society provided additional resources for helping children navigate these complex emotional territories. Aunts and uncles, grandparents and cousins all played roles in maintaining connections to deceased parents while supporting the formation of new family bonds. A child might live with their remarried parent and step-parent, but spend significant time with maternal or paternal relatives who kept the memory and influence of the deceased parent alive. These extended family networks also provided alternative sources of identity and belonging for children who struggled with blended family dynamics. A boy who felt displaced in his father's new household might find acceptance and purpose in his relationship with his mother's brothers. A girl who clashed with her stepmother might develop deep bonds with her father's sisters. These relationships weren't consolation prizes, but genuine sources of love, guidance, and support that enriched children's lives in ways that nuclear families alone couldn't provide. The biblical world's approach to orphaned children reflected similar wisdom about the importance of maintaining connections to deceased parents while providing for practical needs. Orphans weren't typically placed in institutions, but were absorbed into extended family networks or adopted by community members who took responsibility for their upbringing. These arrangements often included explicit provisions for preserving the orphaned children's inheritance rights and family connections. An orphaned child might be raised by an uncle but still be recognized as belonging to their deceased father's line. They would learn about their parents' characters and accomplishments, inherit family traditions and stories, and eventually receive whatever property or possessions their parents had left behind. The goal wasn't to erase their original family identity, but to provide them with new sources of care and support while maintaining their connections to their heritage. These practices reflected the biblical understanding that children belonged not just to their immediate parents, but to larger family and community networks that had obligations to care for them when parents were unable to do so. The phrase, "father to the fatherless," that appears in biblical literature wasn't just poetic language, but a description of real social obligations that communities took seriously. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life provided natural frameworks for helping orphan children maintain connections to deceased parents. During planting season, an uncle might take his orphaned nephew to the fields that had once belonged to the boy's father, teaching him the skills he would have learned from his own parent. During harvest, an aunt might include her orphaned niece in the traditional women's work that the girl's mother would have taught her. These weren't just practical education, but acts of memory and connection that kept deceased parents present in their children's ongoing development. The children learned not just how to plant and harvest, spin and weave, but how their own parents had performed these tasks, what techniques they had preferred, what wisdom they had accumulated through years of experience. The tools and implements that parents left behind took on special significance in this process of connection and education. A farmer's plough wasn't just agricultural equipment, but a link to his knowledge and experience. When his son eventually took up that plough, he was continuing not just agricultural work, but a specific tradition of farming that connected him to his father's memory and expertise. Similarly, a woman's loom, her grinding stone, her cooking vessels. These weren't mere objects, but repositories of knowledge and skill that could be passed down to daughters and daughters-in-law. Learning to use these tools effectively meant learning something about the woman who had used them before, absorbing not just technique, but something of her presence and influence. The gradual transfer of these tools and responsibilities often marked important transitions in the mourning process. When a widowed mother finally felt ready to teach her daughter to use the loom that had belonged to her deceased grandmother. It signaled not just practical necessity, but emotional readiness to share family traditions across generations. When a young man first took his father's tools to the field, it marked his acceptance of adult responsibilities and his willingness to carry forward his father's work. These transitions weren't always smooth or easy. Some bereaved family members clung to the possessions of the deceased, unable to bear the thought of anyone else using them. Others rushed too quickly to redistribute belongings, trying to avoid the pain of daily reminders. The biblical world recognized these different responses to loss and provided flexibility in how families managed the practical aftermath of death. Community elders often played important roles in helping families navigate these decisions about possessions and responsibilities. Their experience with loss and their understanding of family dynamics allowed them to offer guidance about timing and appropriateness. They might suggest that a widow wait a full year before giving away her husband's clothing, allowing time for the initial intensity of grief to subside. They might recommend that a young man begin by borrowing his father's tools occasionally before taking full ownership, easing the emotional transition gradually. The wisdom embedded in these practices reflected centuries of human experience with loss and recovery. The biblical world had learned that grief couldn't be rushed, but also couldn't be allowed to paralyze the living indefinitely. The various customs and traditions surrounding death and mourning provided frameworks for moving through grief at appropriate paces, while ensuring that the practical needs of life were met and that the memory of the deceased was properly honored. As we prepare to rest now, let the gentle wisdom of these ancient practices settle around you like a soft blanket. These people who lived so long ago understood something we sometimes forget in our modern haste: that love doesn't end with death, that memory can be a source of strength rather than just sorrow, and that the human heart has remarkable capacity for carrying both loss and hope at the same time. The biblical world offers us no easy answers to the mystery of mortality, no magic formulas for eliminating grief or pain. But it does provide something perhaps more valuable: tested ways of walking through the valley of the shadow of death with dignity, community support, and the confidence that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. These ancient voices whisper across the centuries, reminding us that countless others have faced what we face, have suffered what we suffer, and have found ways not just to survive, but to discover meaning and even beauty in the midst of loss. Sleep now, knowing that you are part of this great human story of loving and losing, grieving and healing, dying and somehow, mysteriously, living on in the hearts and memories of those who come after us. Tonight, as the oil lamps flicker lower and the desert wind carries the scent of jasmine through narrow windows, we turn to something that might surprise you about death in biblical times. It wasn't the end of relationship between the living and the dead, but rather the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one that would shape how entire communities understood their place in the grand sweep of history. Picture a young scribe named Ezra, perhaps 16 years old, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat in his grandfather's house. The old man has been dead for 3 years now, but tonight Ezra spreads out a piece of precious parchment and begins to write. Not a letter, not a business transaction, but something far more sacred. He's recording his grandfather's genealogy, tracing the family line back through generations of names, each one representing a life lived, a story told, a legacy passed down. This wasn't unusual work for a biblical scribe. In fact, it was considered one of the most important tasks a family could undertake. These genealogical records weren't dry administrative documents, but living testimonies to the continuity of God's covenant with his people. Each name represented not just biological inheritance, but spiritual heritage, connecting the present generation to the great promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob centuries before. The process of creating these family records often began during the extended mourning period after a death, when families had time to gather stories and memories that might otherwise be lost. Elderly relatives would be consulted, their memories probed for details about ancestors whose names were growing dim. Children would be taught not just the names of their great-great-grandparents, but something about their characters, their occupations, their moments of faithfulness or failure. This wasn't ancestor worship in the pagan sense, but something more subtle and profound. The biblical world understood that identity wasn't just individual, but communal, that a person's sense of who they were was intimately connected to their understanding of where they had come from. To know your genealogy was to know your place in God's unfolding plan for his people. The women of the family played crucial roles in preserving these genealogical memories, even though their names might not always appear in the formal records. Mothers and grandmothers were often the keepers of family stories, the ones who remembered which ancestor had shown particular courage during times of persecution, which great-grandmother had been known for her wisdom, which uncle had been a skilled craftsman whose techniques were still used by the family generations later. These stories weren't just told once and forgotten, but were repeated at regular intervals, becoming part of the rhythm of family life. During long winter evenings, when the day's work was done and families gathered around their fires, the older members would share these tales with the younger ones. The stories served multiple purposes: entertainment certainly, but also education about family values, community history, and the ways God had been faithful to their ancestors through times of both blessing and trial. The physical act of recording these genealogies was itself a sacred task. Parchment or papyrus was expensive, ink had to be carefully prepared, and the actual writing required skill and patience. A family might save for months to afford the materials needed to create a proper genealogical record. The scribe chosen for the task, whether a family member or a hired professional, understood that he was creating something that would outlast his own lifetime, something that would be treasured by generations yet unborn. The finished genealogies often became family heirlooms, carefully preserved and passed down from father to son. They might be stored in special containers to protect them from moisture and insects, brought out only on significant occasions to be read aloud to the gathered family. The very act of unrolling these ancient documents and reading the names of long-dead ancestors created a sense of connection across time, a feeling that the present generation was part of something larger and more enduring than their own brief lives. But genealogies weren't the only way biblical families maintained connections with their dead. The practice of naming children after deceased relatives served similar purposes, creating living memorials that kept ancestral names and memories alive in daily family life. When a grandson was given his grandfather's name, it wasn't just honoring the dead man's memory, but creating a bridge between past and future, ensuring that something of the grandfather's identity would continue into the next generation. These naming practices often came with specific expectations and responsibilities. A boy named after his great-grandfather might be told stories about that ancestor's particular virtues or accomplishments, with the implicit understanding that he should strive to embody similar qualities. A girl given her grandmother's name might be taught the traditional recipes and household skills that had made her namesake famous within the family circle. The weight of carrying an ancestral name could be both inspiring and burdensome. Children might feel pressure to live up to the reputations of their namesakes, or they might find comfort in feeling connected to family members they had never met, but whose stories had shaped their understanding of what it meant to belong to their particular family line. The biblical understanding of inheritance went far beyond material possessions to include these intangible legacies of name, story, and expectation. When a father blessed his sons before his death, he wasn't just dividing up his property, but passing on his spiritual authority, his accumulated wisdom, and his place in the ongoing covenant relationship between God and his people. These deathbed blessings were considered prophetic utterances that would shape the futures of the recipients. The words spoken by a dying patriarch carried weight not just because of their emotional significance, but because they were believed to participate in the divine power that governed human destiny. Jacob's blessings of his 12 sons weren't just a father's final words, but prophetic declarations about the futures of the tribes that would descend from them. The recipients of these blessings understood that they were receiving more than good wishes or expressions of paternal affection. They were being entrusted with spiritual responsibilities, given roles to play in the unfolding drama of God's relationship with his chosen people. The blessing created obligations as well as privileges, connecting the individual to purposes larger than personal happiness or success. This understanding of inherited spiritual responsibility influenced how biblical families approached the education and training of their children. Parents weren't just preparing their offspring for economic survival, but for participation in the ongoing covenant community. Children learned not just practical skills, but the stories and traditions that would enable them to pass on their heritage to the next generation. The death of a patriarch or matriarch was therefore not just a personal loss, but a potential crisis for the entire extended family. Who would carry forward the spiritual authority that had been invested in the deceased? How would the family's place in the covenant community be maintained? These weren't just practical questions, but theological ones that required careful consideration and community input. The process of transferring spiritual authority often began long before death actually occurred. Aging patriarchs would gradually delegate more responsibilities to their sons, teaching them not just the mechanics of leadership, but the wisdom needed to guide the family faithfully. Elderly matriarchs would spend increasing time with their daughters and daughters-in-law, passing on the knowledge and skills needed to maintain the household traditions that were so crucial to family identity. This gradual transition served important purposes for both the aging leaders and their successors. The older generation could have confidence that their life's work would continue after their deaths, while the younger generation could grow into their new responsibilities gradually rather than being thrust suddenly into roles they weren't prepared to fill. The community also played important roles in these transitions, providing support and guidance to families navigating the complex process of succession. Elders from other families might offer advice based on their own experiences with similar transitions. The broader community would watch carefully to ensure that spiritual authority was being transferred appropriately and that family traditions were being maintained faithfully. When disputes arose about inheritance or succession, the community might intervene to mediate, drawing on traditional wisdom about how such matters should be handled. These interventions weren't just practical problem-solving, but spiritual oversight, ensuring that the transfer of authority served the broader purposes of maintaining covenant faithfulness within the community as a whole. The biblical world also developed elaborate systems for ensuring that the material needs of surviving family members were met after a death. These weren't just informal arrangements based on goodwill, but structured obligations that were taken seriously by the entire community. The failure to care properly for widows and orphans wasn't just personal callousness, but a violation of covenant responsibilities that could bring divine judgment on the entire community. The law codes preserved in biblical literature contain detailed provisions for the care of vulnerable family members after death. Widows had specific rights to support from their deceased husbands' estates. Orphaned children were entitled to inherit their parents' property and to receive care from extended family members until they reached maturity. These weren't suggestions, but legal requirements that could be enforced by community leaders. The practice of levirate marriage, where a man might marry his deceased brother's widow, served multiple purposes within this system. It provided economic security for the widow and ensured that her deceased husband's name and lineage would continue through any children born from the new union. It also kept property within the extended family, rather than allowing it to pass to strangers through remarriage outside the clan. These arrangements might seem strange or even exploitative to modern sensibilities, but they represented serious attempts to address the practical consequences of death in societies where individual survival often depended entirely on family networks. A widow without family support faced not just loneliness, but genuine threats of starvation and homelessness. An orphaned child without clan protection might be sold into slavery or simply abandoned to die. The biblical emphasis on caring for widows and orphans wasn't just humanitarian concern, but theological conviction. The vulnerable members of society were understood to be under God's special protection, and communities that failed to care for them properly could expect divine retribution. This belief motivated elaborate systems of support that, while imperfect, provided more comprehensive care than many societies have managed to achieve. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life created natural opportunities for remembering and supporting those who had been affected by loss. During harvest time, the law required that portions of crops be left unharvested so that the poor, including widows and orphans, could gather what they needed for survival. This wasn't charity in the modern sense, but recognition that the land's abundance belonged ultimately to God and should be shared with those who had no other means of support. These gleaning practices served multiple purposes beyond mere economic relief. They provided dignified ways for the vulnerable to meet their needs through their own labor rather than through passive dependence on others' generosity. They created regular interactions between different segments of the community, preventing the isolation that might otherwise have afflicted those who had suffered losses. And they served as visible reminders to the entire community of their obligations to care for those whom death had made vulnerable. The festival calendar that punctuated the biblical year also provided structured opportunities for remembering the dead and supporting the living. During major celebrations, families would gather from great distances, creating opportunities for extended relatives to check on widowed or orphaned family members and to provide assistance if needed. These weren't formal welfare programs, but organic expressions of family solidarity that emerged naturally from religious observance. The festivals themselves often included specific provisions for ensuring that those affected by loss weren't excluded from community celebrations. Widows and orphans were explicitly invited to participate in festival meals, not as objects of charity, but as valued members of the community, whose presence was considered essential to proper observance. The joy of the festivals was understood to be incomplete if any members of the community were left out due to their circumstances. The storytelling that was such an important part of festival celebrations provided natural opportunities for keeping the memory of the dead alive within community consciousness. During Passover celebrations, families would recount not just the ancient story of liberation from Egypt, but their own family histories, including the contributions of deceased relatives to the ongoing story of God's faithfulness. These personal narratives became part of the larger narrative of divine providence, connecting individual losses to the broader themes of redemption and hope. The physical spaces where these festivals were celebrated often bore their own testimonies to the presence of the dead within ongoing community life. Family burial caves might be located near the agricultural terraces where harvest festivals were held, creating visual reminders of the generations who had worked the same land and celebrated the same seasonal rhythms. The proximity of the dead to the celebrations of the living wasn't considered morbid, but natural, a reflection of the understanding that death didn't sever family bonds, but transformed them. The biblical world's approach to memorializing the dead was generally modest and practical, rather than elaborate or ostentatious. Grand monuments were typically reserved for kings and other figures of exceptional importance, while ordinary people were remembered through simpler means that integrated memory into daily life rather than setting it apart in special spaces or objects. A farmer might plant a tree near his father's burial place, creating a living memorial that would grow and flourish long after the son himself had died. A woman might establish a pattern of giving a portion of her bread to the poor each week in memory of her deceased mother's generosity. A craftsman might teach his trade to orphaned boys in his community, honoring his own father's memory by passing on the skills that had sustained their family for generations. These memorial practices shared certain characteristics that reflected biblical values and worldview. They were ongoing rather than one-time observances, creating patterns of remembrance that could be sustained over many years. They served practical purposes for the living while honoring the dead, ensuring that memorial activities contributed to community welfare rather than simply consuming resources. and they were accessible to people of all economic levels, since they relied more on intention and consistency than on expensive materials or elaborate ceremonies. The integration of memorial practices into daily routines meant that the dead remained present in the consciousness of the living without dominating it. A widow who gave bread to the poor each week in her husband's memory was neither trying to forget him nor obsessing over his absence, but finding ways to express her continuing love through actions that served the broader community. This balance between remembrance and forward-looking engagement with life reflected the biblical understanding that healthy grief honors the past while remaining open to the future. The biblical emphasis on justice and righteousness also influenced how communities remembered their dead. Those who had lived lives of particular faithfulness or had made significant contributions to community welfare were remembered not just with affection, but as examples to be followed. Their stories became teaching tools, ways of passing on values and encouraging similar behavior in subsequent generations. The memory of the righteous was considered a blessing not just to their families, but to their entire communities. Biblical literature contains numerous references to the ongoing influence of those who had walked with God during their lifetimes. Their examples provided guidance for difficult decisions. Their wisdom continued to shape community practices, and their faithfulness served as evidence that it was possible to live in ways that pleased God even in challenging circumstances. Conversely, the memory of those who had lived wickedly or had caused harm to their communities served as warnings about the consequences of unfaithfulness. These cautionary examples weren't celebrated, but weren't forgotten either, since they provided important lessons about the results of choosing evil over good, selfishness over service, rebellion over obedience to divine will. This moral dimension of memory meant that death didn't automatically result in positive remembrance. The biblical world believed that character mattered not just during life, but in how one was remembered after death. The righteous could expect their names to be spoken with honor by future generations, while the wicked might find their names becoming synonymous with shame and warning. This understanding created powerful incentives for ethical behavior during life. People were motivated to live faithfully not just by immediate rewards or punishments, but by concern for how they would be remembered by their children and grandchildren. The prospect of being remembered as a source of blessing to one's family provided encouragement for difficult choices, while the fear of leaving a legacy of shame served as a deterrent to wrongdoing. The biblical world's approach to death and memory also reflected its understanding of time as linear rather than cyclical. Unlike cultures that saw history as an endless repetition of the same patterns, biblical thought understood time as moving toward a divine purpose that would eventually be fulfilled. This meant that individual deaths, while significant, were part of a larger story that was progressing toward a meaningful conclusion. This linear understanding of time influenced how people thought about their own mortality and the deaths of their loved ones. Death wasn't seen as a return to some primordial state or as absorption into an impersonal cosmic force, but as a step in a journey that would eventually lead to resurrection and renewal. The dead weren't gone forever, but were waiting for the great day when God would restore all things and reunite the living with those who had gone before. This hope of eventual resurrection didn't minimize the reality of present loss or eliminate the need for grief and mourning. But it did provide a framework within which suffering could be understood as temporary rather than ultimate, as part of a larger story that would eventually have a happy ending. The biblical world grieved deeply but not hopelessly, mourned passionately but not despairingly. As we draw near the end of our quiet journey through these ancient ways of understanding death and memory, we find ourselves in a place that feels both foreign and familiar. Foreign because the specific practices and beliefs we've explored emerged from a world so different from our own, with its agricultural rhythms, extended family networks, and intimate relationship between daily life and religious faith. Yet familiar because the fundamental human experiences these practices addressed: love and loss, memory and hope, the need to find meaning in mortality, remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The biblical world offers us no easy answers to the mystery of death, no magic formulas for eliminating grief or guaranteeing peaceful transitions. But it does provide something perhaps more valuable: tested wisdom about how communities can support their members through the darkest valleys of human experience, how memory can become a source of strength rather than paralysis, and how even death itself can be integrated into a larger story of purpose and hope. These ancient voices whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that we are not the first to face these challenges, that countless others have walked these paths before us and found ways not just to survive, but to discover meaning and beauty, even in the midst of loss. Their wisdom, preserved in story and custom, continues to offer guidance for our own journeys through the landscape of mortality. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that you are part of this great human conversation about love and loss, memory and hope, death and the mysterious promise of life that somehow endures even when bodies return to dust. Rest in the knowledge that others have faced what you face, have suffered what you suffer, and have found ways to carry both sorrow and joy, both absence and presence, both ending and beginning in hearts large enough to hold all the contradictions of human existence. Tonight, as the last embers fade in ancient hearths and the desert stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, we turn to perhaps the most mysterious aspect of death in biblical times: the journey of the soul itself. Not the physical body, which we've seen wrapped in linen and laid to rest in family tombs, but that invisible essence that biblical peoples believed continued beyond the grave into realms both wondrous and strange. Picture, if you will, a dying patriarch in the hours before dawn, his breathing shallow and labored, his family gathered close. But in the biblical imagination, this bedside scene was only part of a larger drama, unfolding simultaneously in invisible dimensions. As the old man's spirit prepared to depart, the very air around him was understood to be thick with presences, angels perhaps, or the spirits of ancestors who had gone before, all participating in the sacred transition from life to whatever lay beyond. The Hebrew word for this departing essence was ruach, the same word used for wind or breath, suggesting something both substantial and elusive, something that could be felt but not grasped, observed but not contained. When someone died, their ruach was believed to leave the body and begin a journey that would take them far from the familiar world of olive groves and stone houses into territories that existed beyond the reach of mortal understanding. But where exactly did this journey lead? The biblical world held complex and sometimes contradictory beliefs about the destinations of the dead, beliefs that evolved over centuries and varied among different communities and time periods. The most ancient understanding spoke of Sheol, a shadowy underworld where all the dead gathered regardless of their moral character during life, a place neither of punishment nor reward, but of diminished existence, where spirits dwelt in a kind of twilight consciousness, neither fully alive nor completely extinguished. Imagine Sheol as the ancient imagination conceived it, not the fiery hell of later Christian thought, but something more like a vast underground city shrouded in perpetual dusk. Here the dead existed as shades of their former selves, recognizable but insubstantial, aware but detached from the passionate concerns that had driven them during their earthly lives. They could speak, these ancient texts suggest, but their voices were thin and reedy, like wind through dried grass. They could move but slowly, as if walking through water or heavy sand. The biblical writers who describe Sheol weren't trying to provide a literal geography of the afterlife, but were grappling with fundamental questions about what happens to human consciousness when the body dies. Their vision of this underworld realm reflected their understanding that death, while natural and inevitable, represented a profound diminishment of human experience rather than its complete termination. In Sheol, the dead were cut off from the world above in ways that were almost unbearably poignant. They could no longer praise God, could no longer participate in the festivals and celebrations that had given meaning to their earthly lives, could no longer embrace their children or share meals with their friends. They existed in a state of permanent separation from everything that had made life worth living, conscious of their loss but powerless to remedy it. Yet even in this place of shadows, the biblical imagination suggested that some connections endured. When King Saul consulted the medium at Endor and she summoned the spirit of the prophet Samuel, the dead prophet appeared still clothed in his familiar robe, still possessed of his earthly personality and memories, still capable of prophecy and moral judgment. Death had changed him, but hadn't erased his essential identity or his relationship to the divine purpose he had served during life. This episode, troubling as it was to later biblical interpreters, reveals something important about how ancient peoples understood the persistence of personality beyond death. The dead weren't transformed into entirely different beings, but remained recognizably themselves, carrying forward their earthly characteristics, relationships, and even their roles in the ongoing drama of divine providence. As centuries passed and biblical thought developed, new understandings of the afterlife began to emerge alongside the older vision of Sheol. Some texts began to speak of different destinations for the righteous and the wicked, suggesting that moral character during life might indeed affect one's experience after death. The righteous dead might be gathered to their people in some blessed state, while the wicked might face judgment and punishment. These evolving beliefs reflected growing conviction that the God who demanded justice and righteousness during life wouldn't abandon these principles after death. If the wicked sometimes prospered during their earthly lives while the righteous suffered, surely there must be some eventual accounting, some cosmic balancing of the scales that would vindicate divine justice and reward faithfulness. The development of resurrection hope represented perhaps the most radical transformation in biblical thinking about death and the afterlife. Instead of accepting diminished existence in Sheol as the final human destiny, some biblical writers began to envision a future day when God would call the dead back to life, restoring not just their spirits, but their bodies, returning them to full human existence in a renewed world where justice would reign and suffering would end. This resurrection hope wasn't based on philosophical arguments about the immortality of the soul, but on convictions about God's character and purposes. A God who had created human beings as embodied creatures, who had entered into covenant relationship with them, who had demonstrated faithfulness through countless generations. Such a God wouldn't abandon his people to permanent separation and diminishment. The love that had sustained them during life would find a way to restore them after death. The biblical vision of resurrection wasn't escape from physical existence into some purely spiritual realm, but return to bodily life in a transformed creation where the limitations and sufferings that had marked earthly existence would be overcome. The resurrected dead would be recognizably themselves, but freed from the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that had plagued them during their first lives. This hope profoundly influenced how biblical communities approached death and mourning. Grief remained real and intense. The loss of a loved one's physical presence caused genuine anguish that couldn't be wished away by theological conviction. But the sorrow was tempered by confidence that separation wasn't permanent, that relationships severed by death would eventually be restored, that the love shared during life would prove stronger than the grave. The timing of this promised restoration remained mysterious. Some biblical texts seem to suggest that resurrection would occur immediately after death, while others pointed toward a future day of general resurrection when all the dead would be raised together. Still others hinted at different resurrections for different categories of people. Perhaps the righteous would be raised first, followed later by others who would face judgment for their earthly deeds. These uncertainties didn't trouble ancient believers as much as they might disturb modern systematic theologians. The biblical world was comfortable with mystery, with truths that couldn't be completely understood or neatly categorized. What mattered wasn't having precise knowledge about the mechanics of resurrection, but maintaining confidence in God's faithfulness and power to fulfill his promises. The practical implications of a resurrection hope were profound. If the dead would eventually be restored to life, then death wasn't the ultimate enemy to be feared and avoided at all costs, but a temporary sleep from which believers would eventually awaken. If relationships would be renewed in the resurrection, then the love invested in family and community during earthly life wasn't wasted, but was building eternal bonds that death couldn't permanently destroy. This perspective influenced everything from daily ethical choices to long-term planning. People might be more willing to sacrifice immediate pleasures for eternal rewards if they believed their choices during life would affect their experience after resurrection. They might invest more deeply in relationships if they expected those relationships to continue beyond the grave. They might face persecution and suffering with greater courage if they believed their faithfulness would be vindicated in a future life. The biblical world also developed elaborate beliefs about what happened to souls during the intermediate period between death and resurrection. Some texts suggested that the righteous dead were taken immediately into God's presence, experiencing conscious bliss while awaiting the resurrection of their bodies. Others implied that all the dead slept unconsciously until the Great Awakening, experiencing neither joy nor sorrow during their time in the grave. These different perspectives weren't necessarily contradictory, but might reflect different aspects of a mystery too complex for human understanding to grasp completely. Perhaps time itself worked differently in the realm of the dead, so that what seemed like long centuries to the living passed like moments to those who had died. Perhaps consciousness after death was so different from earthly awareness that normal categories of sleeping and waking, joy and sorrow didn't apply. The biblical writers seemed less concerned with resolving these philosophical puzzles than with providing comfort and hope to grieving communities. Whether the dead were consciously present with God or peacefully sleeping until resurrection, they were safe in divine care, beyond the reach of earthly troubles, assured of eventual restoration to full life and fellowship. The imagery used to describe these post-mortem states drew heavily on the most positive experiences of earthly life. The righteous dead were pictured as resting in green pastures beside still waters, as dwelling in the house of the Lord forever, as sitting at eternal banquets, where hunger and thirst would be no more. These weren't literal descriptions, but poetic attempts to convey experiences that transcended ordinary human language and understanding. The biblical imagination also populated the invisible realms with various categories of spiritual beings who played roles in the drama of death and afterlife. Angels served as messengers and guides, helping souls navigate the transition from earthly to eternal existence. Some texts hinted at more complex hierarchies of spiritual beings, with different orders of angels having different responsibilities in the cosmic order. The presence of these spiritual beings meant that the dying weren't making their final journey alone, but were accompanied by divine messengers who would guide them safely to their ultimate destination. This belief provided comfort to grieving families, who could imagine their loved ones being welcomed into the spiritual realm by beings of light and love, rather than facing the unknown terrors of death without support or guidance. The biblical world also recognized that death could come in many different forms, and that the manner of dying might affect the soul's journey into the afterlife. Those who died peacefully after long lives, surrounded by family and having made proper preparation, were understood to have the smoothest transitions. Their souls departed gently, like breath released on a quiet sigh, and their journey to the spiritual realm was like a peaceful voyage across calm waters. But death wasn't always so gentle. Warriors who died in battle, victims of disease or accident, those who died young or unexpectedly. Their transitions might be more turbulent, their souls departing suddenly like birds startled from their nests. Yet even these difficult deaths weren't understood as impediments to eventual salvation. God's mercy was believed to be greater than human circumstances. Divine love, more powerful than the chaos that sometimes surrounded mortal endings. The biblical communities developed various practices designed to help souls make successful transitions from earthly to eternal life. Deathbed prayers and blessings weren't just expressions of love, but were believed to have spiritual power, providing divine protection for the departing soul and ensuring safe passage through whatever trials might await in the invisible realm. The timing of these prayers was considered crucial. Words spoken while the dying person could still hear them were thought to accompany the soul on its journey, providing comfort and guidance during the initial stages of post-mortem existence. Final blessings given by parents to their children, or by spiritual leaders to their communities, carried particular weight and were believed to shape the eternal destinies of their recipients. The biblical understanding of souls and afterlife also influenced how communities dealt with various types of problematic deaths. Suicides, murders, deaths in foreign lands far from family burial places. These situations created special anxieties about the welfare of the deceased souls and required particular ritual responses to ensure that the dead weren't left vulnerable or abandoned in the spiritual realm. When someone died far from home, families would sometimes send messengers to retrieve the body for proper burial in the ancestral tomb. But if this proved impossible, they might perform symbolic burial rites, creating empty graves or memorial markers that would serve as focal points for ongoing prayers and remembrance. The important thing wasn't the physical location of the remains, but ensuring that the deceased soul maintained its connection to the family and community that would continue to pray for its welfare. These practices reflected the understanding that death didn't immediately sever all bonds between the living and the dead, but that there was an ongoing relationship requiring care and attention from both sides. The living had obligations to pray for the dead and to maintain their memory through proper observances. The dead, in turn, were believed to maintain concern for their living descendants and to serve as intercessors who could petition God on behalf of their families. This continuing relationship between living and dead created a kind of extended community that transcended the boundaries of mortality. Families understood themselves as including not just their living members, but also their deceased ancestors and their future descendants not yet born. Decisions made during earthly life had to take into account their effects on this larger community, which existed partially in time and partially in eternity. The seasonal rhythms that governed earthly life were also believed to affect the spiritual realm, creating times when the boundaries between living and dead became more permeable. During certain festivals, the deceased were thought to return to visit their families, participating invisibly in celebrations and blessing their living descendants. These weren't ghost stories or supernatural visitations, but expressions of the belief that love transcended death and that family bonds endured beyond the grave. The preparation for these seasonal visits required careful attention to traditional customs and proper spiritual preparation. Families would clean their homes thoroughly, prepare special foods that had been favorites of deceased relatives, and gather to share stories and memories that would welcome the visiting spirits. Children learned to set places at table for ancestors they had never met, maintaining connections across generations through ritual acts of inclusion and remembrance. These practices served multiple functions within biblical communities. They provided structured ways for dealing with grief and loss, ensuring that the dead weren't forgotten while preventing unhealthy obsession with the past. They reinforced family bonds and community identity by connecting present generations to their heritage and traditions. And they maintained hope for eventual reunion by treating death as temporary separation rather than permanent ending. The biblical imagination also developed rich traditions about what the resurrected life would be like when God finally restored the dead to full existence. These weren't detailed blueprints, but poetic visions that attempted to convey the joy and fulfillment that awaited those who had remained faithful during their earthly pilgrimage. The resurrected would have bodies, but bodies transformed and perfected, no longer subject to disease, aging, or death. They would recognize their loved ones, but would also be capable of relationships and experiences that transcended anything possible during mortal life. They would inhabit a renewed creation where the beauty and abundance of Eden would be restored and exceeded, where the knowledge of God would be complete and unmediated, where justice and peace would reign forever. These visions of ultimate restoration provided comfort during times of loss and suffering, but they also created responsibilities for how believers should live during their earthly lives. If the body was destined for resurrection, then it deserved respect and care during its mortal existence. If relationships would continue beyond death, then the love and service invested in them during life took on eternal significance. If choices made on earth would affect eternal destiny, then every decision became a matter of ultimate importance. As the night deepens around us and these ancient visions of souls and afterlife settle into our consciousness like gentle rain, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between the seen and unseen worlds, between time and eternity, between the familiar sorrows of mortality and the mysterious promises of life beyond death. The biblical world offered no simple answers to the great questions that death poses to human hearts and minds. But it did provide something perhaps more valuable, a framework for living with mystery, for maintaining hope in the face of loss, for believing that love is stronger than death and that the God who created us for relationship will not abandon us to permanent separation and silence. These ancient voices continue to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that we are not the first to wonder what happens when the breath leaves the body and the spirit departs for unknown realms. Others have walked this path before us, have faced these same fears and hopes, and have found ways to live faithfully in the space between birth and death, between earth and heaven, between the known and the unknowable. Sleep now in the confidence that you are held by the same divine love that sustained our ancestors through their journeys from life through death toward whatever lies beyond. Rest in the knowledge that the questions that trouble your heart have been asked by countless others, and that the hope they discovered in the midst of mystery remains available to guide and comfort you through your own encounter with the great transition that awaits us all. The morning after death brought its own sacred rhythms, as inevitable as sunrise over the Judean hills. In those first pale hours when the world stirred to life around them, biblical families faced the profound task of saying goodbye, not just to a beloved presence, but to a way of being that had shaped their daily existence for years or decades. Picture Sarah, a widow of perhaps 40 years, standing in the doorway of her small stone house as the first merchants begin to move through the narrow streets of her village. Inside, her husband David lies wrapped in his burial shroud, surrounded by the herbs and spices that will accompany him to the tomb. But Sarah's mind isn't on the immediate tasks ahead, the procession, the burial, the ritual obligations that must be fulfilled before the sun reaches its zenith. Instead, she's thinking about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the endless days stretching ahead, when she'll wake to silence where once there was the soft sound of David's breathing beside her. This moment of anticipating the future while still holding the present grief. This too was part of the biblical understanding of death. The ancient world knew that burial was not an ending, but a beginning. The start of a long journey through landscapes of memory and adjustment that would reshape not just individual lives, but entire family structures and community relationships. The women who would prepare David's body understood this intimately. As they worked through the early morning hours, washing and anointing, wrapping and blessing, they weren't just caring for a corpse, but preparing a beloved community member for his transition from the world of the living to the realm of the ancestors. Every gesture was performed with the knowledge that this was the last service they could offer, the final act of love in a relationship that had been built through years of shared meals, festival celebrations, and mutual support through times of both joy and hardship. The spices they used, myrrh and aloes, cinnamon and cassia, weren't chosen randomly, but reflected deep cultural understanding of death as a journey requiring proper preparation. These precious substances were believed to ease the soul's transition from earthly existence to whatever lay beyond. while their sweet fragrance masked the harsh realities of physical decay and provided comfort to grieving family members who would carry these scents in their memories long after the burial was complete. As the sun climbed higher and the time for burial approached, the house would fill with a strange mixture of sorrow and purposeful activity. Children too young to fully understand what was happening would sense the gravity of the occasion and move more quietly than usual, their usual games and laughter subdued by the weight of adult grief surrounding them. Older children would be given small tasks, carrying messages, helping to prepare food, arranging flowers, that allowed them to participate in the family's work of honoring the dead while learning important lessons about community responsibility and the sacred nature of death. The men of the family would be making their own preparations, not just for the physical work of carrying the body to its resting place, but for the spiritual responsibilities that would fall on them in the days and weeks ahead. The eldest son, if there was one, would soon find himself occupying his father's place, not just in family councils, but in the broader community networks that sustained village life. Younger sons would need to reassess their own roles and responsibilities, while sons-in-law might discover new obligations to their wife's family that they hadn't previously considered. These shifts in family dynamics weren't just practical adjustments, but reflected the biblical understanding of death as a cosmic event that rippled outward through extended networks of relationship and obligation. When a patriarch died, his death affected not just his immediate family, but his business partners, his neighbors, the families of his children's spouses, even the poor widows and orphans whom he might have regularly supported through his charity. The entire social fabric of the community required reweaving around the absence his death had created. The burial procession itself served as a public acknowledgement of these widespread effects. As family and friends gathered in the courtyard of the house where David lay, as professional mourners began their traditional laments and neighbors arrived carrying food and flowers, the scope of the loss became visible to all. This wasn't a private family tragedy, but a community event that required collective response and mutual support. The route to the burial ground would be carefully chosen to pass through the heart of the village, ensuring that even those who couldn't attend the burial itself would have opportunities to pay their respects. Shopkeepers would pause in their work as the procession passed, artisans would set down their tools, children would stop their play and stand quietly as the wrapped body was carried by. These moments of communal recognition served important functions, acknowledging the deceased person's place in the broader community, while also reminding everyone present of their own mortality and the importance of living faithfully while time remained. The tomb itself, carved into the rocky hillside that overlooked the village, represented the final earthly destination, but not the end of relationship. Here, among the bones of his ancestors, David would take his place in the long line of family patriarchs who had shaped the clan's identity and traditions over many generations. The placement of his body beside theirs wasn't just practical conservation of space, but a symbolic statement about the continuity of family bonds across the boundaries of life and death. As the mourners returned from the burial ground, their work was far from finished. The 7 days of intensive mourning that lay ahead would require sustained community effort to ensure that David's family was supported through the most difficult period of their grief. Meals would need to be prepared and served, since the immediate family was forbidden from cooking during this sacred time. Visitors would need to be welcomed and cared for as they came to pay their respects and share their memories. Children would need extra attention and comfort as they struggled to understand the changes that death had brought to their familiar world. But perhaps, most importantly, the stories would need to be told. In a culture where written records were rare and expensive, the preservation of family history depended almost entirely on oral tradition, passed down through careful storytelling from one generation to the next. The week of mourning provided crucial opportunities for elderly relatives to share their memories of David's childhood, his young adulthood, his courtship and marriage, his struggles and triumphs as he built his household and established his place in the community. These stories weren't just entertainment for grief-stricken family members, but essential work of cultural preservation. Through the telling and retelling of David's life story, his character would be fixed in family memory. His wisdom would be preserved for future generations, and his example would continue to guide his descendants long after his physical presence had faded from living memory. The nephew who remembered David's patience with difficult customers would carry that lesson into his own business dealings. The daughter who recalled her father's gentleness with elderly relatives would know how to care for her own aging parents when the time came. The biblical world understood that death, for all its finality, was also a moment of transformation, not just for the soul of the deceased, but for the entire community that had known and loved them. The gap left by their absence would gradually be filled not by forgetting, but by remembering, not by replacing what was lost, but by incorporating the gifts they had given into the ongoing life of family and community. As weeks turned to months and the acute phase of mourning gave way to longer-term adjustment, David's family would discover new rhythms of life that honored his memory while acknowledging the reality of his absence. Sarah might continue to prepare his favorite foods on festival days, not from inability to accept his death, but as a way of including him symbolically in family celebrations. His tools might be carefully maintained and eventually passed to his sons, carrying with them not just practical utility, but the accumulated skill and wisdom of generations of craftsmen. The seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life would provide natural frameworks for this ongoing process of remembrance and integration. Spring planting would bring memories of David's knowledge of soil and weather, his ability to read the signs that indicated the right time for sowing different crops. Summer growth would recall his patient attention to young plants, his skill at managing irrigation and protecting tender shoots from pests and diseases. Autumn harvest would evoke his joy at successful crops, his generosity in sharing abundance with neighbors and strangers who had less. These agricultural memories weren't just personal nostalgia, but practical inheritance that would continue to benefit his family and community for years to come. The farming techniques he had developed through decades of experience, the varieties of crops he had found to work best in local conditions, the networks of cooperation he had built with neighboring farmers, all of these would live on in the practices of those who had learned from him. The biblical understanding of death as transition rather than termination meant that these continuing influences weren't considered supernatural or ghostly, but natural expressions of the way knowledge and wisdom passed from one generation to the next. David's presence in his family's ongoing life wasn't the result of his spirit lingering in earthly locations, but of the deep impression his personality and teachings had made on those who knew him best. This process of integration and inheritance would continue for decades, as David's grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the grandfather they had never met, as his great-grandchildren learned traditional family recipes and techniques that bore the invisible imprint of his preferences and innovations. In this way, the biblical world achieved a kind of practical immortality that didn't depend on philosophical speculation about the soul's destiny, but on the simple human capacity for learning, remembering, and passing on what had been received from previous generations. The death rituals we have explored together, from the deathbed vigil through the burial procession to the extended periods of mourning and remembrance, weren't just ways of processing grief, but comprehensive systems for ensuring that the wisdom and love accumulated during a lifetime wouldn't be lost when the body returned to dust. They represented humanity's deepest insights into how communities could remain strong and coherent, even in the face of inevitable loss, how the bonds of love could prove stronger than death itself. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through these ancient practices, we find ourselves returned to where we began, to the recognition that death, for all its mystery and sorrow, was understood by biblical peoples not as defeat, but as completion, not as ending, but as fulfillment of the divine purpose that had given meaning to earthly existence from the very beginning. The oil lamps that had burned beside David's deathbed have long since guttered out, their light replaced by the eternal radiance that biblical faith promised would welcome all souls who had lived faithfully during their earthly pilgrimage. The voices that sang his praises and mourned his passing have been silenced by their own encounters with mortality. Their bodies laid to rest beside his, in the family tomb carved into the hillside overlooking their village. Yet something of their wisdom remains, preserved not in monuments of stone, but in the continuing human need to find meaning in mortality, comfort in community, and hope in the face of loss. Their understanding that death was not the enemy of life, but its natural companion, that grief was not weakness but love, persisting beyond physical presence, that memory was not mere nostalgia, but active participation in the ongoing story of human community. These insights continue to offer guidance for our own journeys through the landscape of loss and healing. Tonight, as you settle into peaceful rest, carry with you the gentle wisdom of these ancient voices who learned to face death, not with terror but with dignity, not in isolation but in the embrace of loving community, not in despair but in quiet confidence that the love which had sustained them in life would prove stronger than the grave itself. Sleep now in the knowledge that you too are part of this great human story of loving and losing, grieving and healing, dying and somehow mysteriously, continuing to live on in the hearts and memories of those whose lives you have touched. The shadows have grown long now, and the ancient world fades back into the mists of time from which we called it forth. But the truths it revealed about human nature, about the power of community to heal and sustain, about the possibility of finding meaning even in the face of ultimate mystery. These remain as fresh and relevant as the breath you draw, as near as the beating of your own heart, as certain as the dawn that will greet you when your rest is finished and you wake to face whatever joys and sorrows the new day may bring. Rest well, dear friend, knowing that you are held by the same love that comforted our ancestors in their times of trial, guided by the same hope that sustained them through their darkest valleys, and blessed with the same promise that their journey through death was not a journey into nothingness, but into the very heart of the divine mystery from which all life springs and to which all life ultimately returns.